The media sells a fantasy of hypersonic missiles. It's a misdirection. The primary vector in modern state conflict is not a sound. It is the strategic induction of silence. According to CSIS analysis, the operational mapping of critical subsea data cables is not espionage. It is the battlefield preparation for disconnecting the West's central nervous system. Simultaneously, the high ground of space is neutralized, not with kinetic anti-satellite weapons, which are costly and escalatory, but with low-cost dazzlers and electronic warfare. Latvia's SAB has issued warnings about precisely these types of cyber threats against critical infrastructure. The objective is not asset destruction, but asset denial. To blind a billion-dollar eye in the sky, rendering it a useless piece of orbiting hardware. When you sever the flow of data from the seabed and the flow of intelligence from orbit, you do not create a wounded beast. You create a blind leviathan, a hegemon with unparalleled kinetic power that cannot see its targets, cannot communicate with its assets, and cannot process its own financial transactions. A trillion-dollar war machine rendered inert without a single shot fired. This is not theory. It is protocol. A solvency crisis is the accelerant. As financial authorities like Jamie Dimon warn, the U.S. debt itself is a systemic risk that triggers future crises. Adversaries calculate this. They understand our systemic financial liability directly limits our capacity to sustain a long-term, high kinetic cost conflict. Blinding us is the logical, low-cost method to make deployment economically and therefore strategically impossible. The motive is not ideology. It is a solvency crisis. CSIS analysis of the Russian Federation's strategic posture confirms this principle. A prolonged, unpopular kinetic conflict becomes a terminal domestic liability. It drains fiscal reserves and, more critically, political capital. This weakness forces a pivot. When a state cannot afford symmetric warfare, it is compelled to adopt asymmetric protocols to achieve its objectives. The shift is not a choice. It is a mathematical function of a declining balance sheet. This is not a uniquely Russian problem. It is a blueprint. According to Jamie Dimon's stark public warning, the United States faces its own ticking clock, a systemic debt load that threatens to trigger a future crisis. This is not a political talking point. It is a documented financial liability broadcast to every global competitor. Our national solvency is the primary vulnerability, a known battlefield parameter that dictates adversary strategy. An adversary, therefore, does not need to achieve military parity. They only need to make the cost of conflict unsustainable for the hegemon. The strategy shifts from defeating our military to bankrupting our treasury. Analysis of a potential U.S.-Iran conflict shows precisely this vector: immediate catastrophic shocks to global oil prices, inflation, and equity markets. The adversary's goal is to trigger a cascade failure in our own system, turning our economic interdependence into a launch-on-warning weapon against us. This financial fragility dictates the escalation ladder. Weakness forces the pivot to asymmetry. The first and most logical vector is low-cost, high-impact denial. As Latvian intelligence warns regarding Russian cyber threats, the target is industrial control systems, the digital spine of Western critical infrastructure. It is the cheapest way to impose massive economic and societal costs without firing a single shot. This is not a hypothetical. It is the opening phase of the protocol. This is the economics of lethality. The Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, provides the baseline figures. On one side, a $5 million main battle tank, a complex, crew-dependent, high-maintenance asset. On the other, a $500 first-person view drone with an explosive payload. The math is the weapon. For the cost of one tank, an adversary can field 10,000 threats. This isn't a balanced equation, it is an economic execution. This radical cost inversion is what strategists call the democratization of violence. The capability to neutralize multi-million-dollar platforms is no longer exclusive to superpowers. It has been decentralized. The barrier to entry for projecting lethal strategic force has collapsed to the price of consumer electronics. This creates a new battlefield where the primary vector of attack is economic attrition. For a hegemon already navigating a systemic solvency crisis, this asymmetry is fatal. The kinetic cost of conventional warfare has been inflated to unsustainable levels. Every deployed asset becomes a massive liability, a high-value target for a low-cost threat. The adversary doesn't need to achieve victory, they only need to raise the cost of conflict until it triggers a financial collapse on the hegemon's home front. The battlefield has expanded to include the balance sheet. The protocol does not activate in a vacuum. It requires a staging ground, a gray zone, where the vectors of asymmetric warfare can be calibrated without triggering a launch-on-warning response. These zones are not the cause of the systemic risk. They are proxy laboratories for it. We see the first vector in play. Latvia's SAB warns of Russian cyber threats targeting Western industrial control systems. This is low-cost denial, a probe. The second vector is raising the kinetic cost. A conflict in a single choke point like the Strait of Hormuz is projected to trigger cascading global price shocks in oil and stocks, making conventional power projection economically unsustainable. Therefore, internal instability in regions like Southern Africa is not the disease, but a symptom, a theater to test Western response times and measure the precise economic pain tolerance before a kinetic response is triggered. Each probe refines the blueprint that North Korea perfected, the use of asymmetric leverage to neutralize a superior conventional force. These are not random acts of chaos. They are data points, collected in real time to calculate the exact moment a hegemon's solvency crisis paralyzes its will to fight. The launch-on-warning doctrine is not a strategy of aggression. It is a protocol of desperation. Strategic analysis from institutions like CSIS confirms its function: to fire nuclear assets upon detection of an incoming strike before those assets can be destroyed in their silos. This hair-trigger posture is a mathematical response to the threat of a decapitation strike. It's designed to guarantee retaliation. However, the protocol has a systemic vulnerability. It assumes the data is clean. This is the entry point for the asymmetric vector. The target is not the silo, it is the sensor. Intelligence agencies like Latvia's SAB issue explicit warnings of state-sponsored cyber threats targeting Western critical infrastructure. The ultimate critical infrastructure is not the power grid. It is the command, control, and communications network that underpins nuclear deterrence. The objective is to introduce ambiguity into the data stream, to create a fog of digital war. When a cyber attack blinds the early warning radar, the protocol forces a zero-sum decision. The commander is presented with ambiguous, corrupted data that mimics a full-scale launch. If they wait for confirmation that will never arrive, they risk the complete neutralization of their nation's kinetic power. If they follow the protocol based on compromised data, they initiate global thermonuclear war. The cyber attack doesn't destroy the weapon. It forces the owner's hand to use it. This is the ultimate asymmetric leverage, turning our own defensive doctrine into the mechanism of our own destruction. Within the next 12 months, expect a systemic attribution impossible blackout targeting a Tier 1 U.S. maritime port and its adjacent data infrastructure. This will not be a random act of cyber vandalism. It is a calibration shot, engineered to test the paralysis threshold of a hegemon constrained by its own balance sheet. The protocol is a mathematical certainty. A nation's capacity for kinetic power projection is inversely proportional to its systemic financial liability. As Jamie Dimon warns, the U.S. debt itself is the accelerant for a future crisis, forcing adversaries into an asymmetric escalation ladder where the first vector is low-cost denial. The operational blueprint is public. Intelligence from Latvia's SAB explicitly warns of Russian cyber threats targeting Western industrial control systems. This is not about battlefield dominance. It is about raising the economic cost of conflict to an unsustainable level, a strategy detailed in analyses of a potential Gulf War's impact on global prices and inflation. This event will be designed for plausible deniability: a faulty transformer, a software bug, a solar flare. The objective is not destruction, but data. It is a probe to measure our economic pain tolerance and political response time under extreme financial duress, calibrating for the next phase of escalation. The solvency crisis is no longer just a financial liability. It is the primary vector for an existential one.